Broken Circle presents a story preeminent fictional podcast, Pull a String, Season 1, Unsettling Forecast, Episode 1, Confluence. Do you love stories, especially those that are dark, strange, and uncanny? This is your personal invitation to come along to where safety is left behind, where so much more is possible, and everything you know might just slowly, stealthily unravel. Do you see that thread dangling in front of you? Yes, that one. Along the border of the life you've woven. Go on, give it a slight pull. Can you stop the incessant urge once it has taken hold? Would you even try? Now this is what will happen to our hero, Jonah R, on a certain night when he enters an innocent-looking cafe. Keep going if you dare, but be warned, if you pull a string, you might undo the whole thing. For a long while, my life was uncomplicated and easy, with very few real challenges. One day just passed into another, with its predictable routines. Then an evening came when all that changed. You see, after the pandemic, I'd resolved not to sit at home moldering anymore. Looking back, I wonder, what were my expectations really? To meet someone? Find a new circle of friends? What I did encounter was something very unexpected. An elderly man who began telling me disturbing, unsettling stories. I believed at first they were mere fables, but he pulled me in. How he dangled a colorful and dazzling thread in front of me, and what else could I do but reach out and take hold? From the Journal of Jonah R, dated Tuesday, August 9th, 2022. I am going to try and write out this entry as if it were a report of what transpired yesterday evening. You can imagine, I am sure, that it was a bit of a surprise. Several weeks ago, I finally followed up on my resolution. As soon as possible, I had to go out once more and socialize in some way. Even under the best of circumstances, this has always been hard for me. I had grown sick of and bored with the sight of my own place, having endured one too many days there by myself during the lockdowns. Now, a key part of my resolution was not only to spend more time out, but also, in part, to do so just after work. So I started trying different coffee shops until I found one where I felt comfortable just hanging out. I am, you see, a certified public accountant. I work at a very prosperous firm in the area of Shipley, Ohio. Yes, it can be terribly boring and sometimes not very challenging. It's a convenient way to earn a living. I also enjoy the daily structure it provides, yet I often find myself growing contemplative in my more quiet moments. I wonder if there isn't more I can do with my life, skills, and knowledge, but my hands are tied by other obligations. My family likes a predictable bet. They love safe, even adore it. Yet the dreadfully unimaginative procedures, the tedious processes that I must conform to that are so often predictable and stressful can leave me both worn out and restless. It wouldn't do any good just going home and crashing any longer. I needed a unfamiliar, fresh environment where I could unwind and get away for a couple of hours or so. A place I could just alight after dinner and perhaps think through what really has been bothering me. Most of the time I end up sitting here quietly, observing others or simply being lost in the risky labyrinth of my own thoughts. Sometimes I also end up journaling. I sit and make an attempt at looking normal. Yeah, maybe. It's a bit futile. Once people get to know me and learn just how I think and view the world, they just seem to shuffle off elsewhere. I have only ever had just a few close friends, and many of them have moved away over the years, while I've stayed put. Oh, you can still chat online, but it's never the same. I've now been going there for about 3 weeks, give or take a day or two. This coffee room, by the way, is called the Berserker Cafe. It is a different kind of name, I agree. But I like their Java and sometimes other beverages. There is something particularly expert and special about whatever process they use in roasting and brewing the coffee. Over these first few weeks, I've had a few casual, polite conversations. Once the regulars noticed I kept coming back. Only one or two were more extensive. Sometimes I got the feeling that I was being sized up, if not vetted for some inscrutable reason. I am still not sure if I am being paranoid or more perceptive than usual. I can't help it. Although the sense of this has after a little while begun to subside, certain people still regularly say hello or talk about the weather, even ask how I am doing. All of these trivial conversations still last no more than a few minutes, never going any deeper. Be that as it may, I still observed other people. Some were regulars, some were not, and their details, movements, habits, preferences. Other times I just sit there and think, ignoring others. Over the last few weeks, I have been seriously pondering my own life, growing a bit too reflective, maybe. And I keep hearing that word like a drum beating the same rhythm over again. Safe. Maybe my world is a little too safe. Now I couldn't help but also notice an elderly man who was usually playing chess with the same opponent, and one he almost always defeated. Yet the other man kept coming back, for all I know, day after day. It would usually be between 7:30 and 7:45 when he would give up and take his empty mug up to the counter, shuffle back in, appearing crestfallen, and say good night to the perpetual winner. The champion would sit there a while, a king in all his glory, and finish his drink. Sometimes he would get another. On this night he simply sat there playing with a pocket watch he had dangling from a particularly ornate chain, and then stared at the open device. For only a moment he looked haggard and vulnerable, eyes distant, his face full of some strange, unexpressed sadness, etched deep inside. I have seen something similar on the face of others who have known tragic losses and have a brokenness mere time cannot heal. As he whispered something, he shuddered. His words, even though they were spoken softly, had just enough force that I heard him. Of all men's miseries, the bitterest is this, to know so much and have control over nothing. Without thinking, I said out loud, Herodotus. With a slow movement, his head lifted, his hand still clenching the opened pocket watch. At first his eyes were still far away, somewhere I'd never been, maybe couldn't imagine at this point. Then they found me. Those aged eyes, still pure emeralds, were undiminished in their light. The focused, stern look he had at first softened into a smile. Not many people know of Herodotus these days, young man, and even among those who do, most would certainly not have recognized a single quote, much less that one. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your thoughts. I stumbled about for an explanation. I have a pretty good memory. I also read and retain a lot, so it just came out without thinking. A good practice, reading in general, and history in particular, although the knowledge of it can cause a lot of pain, especially the history of the last 200 years. He paused, his eyes darting over me. He didn't move for a moment. May I join you? He finally asked. I nodded, suddenly glad of the company. You look familiar to me. Have we met somewhere before? I shook my head. I've only been coming here a couple of weeks. No, not here. Maybe when you were younger, perhaps? I shook my head again. I asked about the gold pocket watch I had noticed earlier. He genuinely did not look familiar to me. A parting gift from the agency. He stopped, shrugged, corrected himself. The corporation I worked for, given upon, the occasion of my retirement. He paused. So what do you do? I'm an accountant, I replied, shrugging now myself. It's steady work and I like the structure and discipline. I didn't feel a need to give any further explanation. He nodded. I'm Timothy Zohar. He thrust out his hand. When I took it after a moment's hesitation, still recovering, I suppose, from 2 years of interpersonal restrictions. His handshake was an iron grip. Most people here just call me Tim, though. No need for formality. Jonah. For some reason I could not name, I was suddenly reluctant to share my last name. So, what did you do? What corporation did you work for? He didn't answer immediately, but instead got that same inscrutable look he'd had earlier. The silence that followed was a little too deep for such a common question. Unfortunately, that all remains confidential. I did research for a place which still keeps most of its activities out of the public eye. have to stay wise to any competitor, so even ex-employees still keep stum about it. Sensitive research, I understand. There are always trade secrets, the flotsam and jetsam of uncompleted projects, orphaned ideas never fully developed, and still in limbo, as well as many other lingering fragments stuck in our heads even when we leave there. Mr. Zohar paused. A little taste of being dangerous, I suppose. He smiled as if it contained a secret joke. Can't take the chance something will accidentally leak out during a conversation. I nodded as if in complete sympathy. So, what keeps you coming back here? A door must have opened somewhere. Felt as if the temperature in the room had dropped a bit too quickly. Timothy must have noticed it himself, since he became silent for a few seconds. Abruptly he continued, just curious. I remembered his question again. I like the atmosphere. You can find a few people to converse with, or just people watch. Even write and mind your own business, if that is what you want. Did you ever wonder about the name of the place? The Berserker Cafe? Not much, I said. It's distinctive enough. I get the reference. Insane Germanic bearskin-wearing warriors. I took a sip from my cup, as if to emphasize my point. Simply put, this place has good coffee. Nice unique blends. Some strong, some soft. They must have a good supplier. He snorted. You'd be surprised. Silence followed. Timothy Zohar did not choose to elaborate at the time. So where was this corporation at? Here in Shipley or in Akron? Akron was just to the east of us. Neither. I moved here to retire. I had chosen that moment to take another sip from my coffee cup. I started coughing. Are you okay? Yes, I managed to choke out. He waited patiently for my voice to return. It's just an unusual life choice. There were reasons. This place is a bit under the radar, so to speak. I am sure my eyes widened at that point. I see that. No, I don't. I managed a whimsical smile. But I won't pry any further. I can respect your privacy, I said, thinking at that moment, even trust it. I suddenly liked Mr. Zohar. There were no reasons I could name consciously. There was just this shift. I was tempted to mention my uncle and what everyone in the family suspected he did, but I kept that quiet, wondering if they were in the same profession. I appreciate it, he nodded, and then his eyes shifted away from me and he looked down at an old local newspaper. It was probably the Tire City Sentinel, a free paper where anything and everything was advertised. Someone had left it there for a while. It seemed on a journey from table to table. It was folded long ways, so only one page was showing. It advertised a series of local folk concerts, which took place up near Peninsula. Here I saw him arch a white eyebrow. He smiled wistfully, shook his head. Something interesting or amusing? I asked. Funny. Interesting, even. I never knew they had concerts in the Cuyahoga Valley. Given what? I asked. I felt I was dancing on the threshold of something I could not name. Just thinking about the perpetual interest in folk music these days. Perhaps not as intense as in the 60s, but still around. Ancient songs, tunes old as the hills, music passed down across ages. The instruments, even the lyrics might shift and change over time, but the notes are the same. Few people think how wonderful, even dark and dangerous, some of them might be, or how dreadfully ancient, a remnant from some lost ritual whose strange practices have been almost forgotten. Not everything passed down from the deep past is good. Surely the venerable and ancient songs are not a problem? I ask only half seriously. Depends. Do you mind if an old man shares something he learned with you? And later on, perhaps, one of his experiences? No. At this point, I'd already started taking mental notes. I have a very good memory for such things. Please, I said, I'd be interested. Well, thank you. Listening is a skill in short supply these days. Actually, paying attention to things for even more than a few minutes, even less. He peered at me. Sure you are ready? It seemed a strange question, but I nodded anyway, leaning back. First, the beginning. It will take a little bit of history, or what is it called these days? Backstory? Yes, that's it, the backstory. In short, I'll have to familiarize you with a few facts first, and then proceed from there, if that is all right. And so he began this story. I'll relate this as best as I can. I was never in possession of all the facts, or called upon all the witnesses that remained. Many were already gone from this earth, nor did I read every document. Quite a few had been collected by that time. What I did learn is etched in my memory, and it is sharp but not perfect. In the end, I did hear that song. It has never left me, and still comes back once in a while. He took a deep breath. Now, the world of collectors is a bit strange. There are always the casual ones, in the majority, who are always short of cash for that new find, or seeking for what will never be found. Then there are those others who can buy whatever they want, from whomever they want, or find alternative ways of gaining possession if their offers are refused. Tonight, though, I will instead tell you about how this particular item came about. As I said, first a bit of background may help. This was in the very early days of country music. Back then it was sometimes called hillbilly music or old-time music or more rarely, mountain music. And that period is often shrouded in a kind of mist, as a new form of American music, just emerging out of what had been traditional ballads and tunes. Some decades later, fusing with gospel and folk songs from other regions, it would blossom and give birth to more than a few new styles. Everything was fermenting, and no one suspected where it would all lead. Worse yet, this was untamed popular music, and it was ancient and contemporary at the same time. In that transitory early stage of reach, then a small flood was opened up, allowing strange forces to manifest themselves. This is just one such story, not even the only one I've heard, but that's for another time. A few local recording studios, most often attached to radio stations, gradually cropped up, only to disappear just as easily. Not everything from those early days has survived. For a few other recordings, it would have been better if they hadn't. What later became the Grand Ole Opry was already in existence, although it wasn't named that until later, in 1927. Its existence, however, might just spur some other local businessman to try his hand at the new medium, especially if he had spare cash and could afford the initial cost. It was a great risk, though, and many who tried across the country crashed and burned long before Wall Street did so in 1929. Some of these have just disappeared entirely from the historic record, a few accidentally and some deliberately, with often very mixed motives from fans and collectors. So, Jonah, remember that this was the 1920s, and in Kentucky, the post-war roar was just penetrating into those rural areas and medium-sized towns. Radio stations were few and still the new thing, bringing different and dangerous styles, information, and culture that might not be readily approved from any pulpit. More and more people picked up record players or bought one of the new radio sets, becoming commercially available. By no means everywhere, but just enough, you understand. Just enough to trouble the waters. It was on a sultry Saturday evening in 1926 that a promotional concert was being given at the local radio station, WKVR, in Covingford, Kentucky. That isn't the real name, you understand. I could tell you, but I don't want you trying to trace this. And simultaneously as a costly experiment on a sister station, WWIZ. The concert, set to last about an hour, had several players and bands lined up. One source claimed that Eck Robertson was supposed to make an appearance that night and play both Apple Blossom and Forked Deer, two recordings that he would never end up releasing. There were a few others whose names do not matter. A new artist who'd had one small hit was now introducing his new songs. What that first album was, no one knows anymore. There were only one song per side in those days. You should know that rumors followed those songs as well, but no one else, I think, has been able to track them down. A number of people, all amongst its most prominent citizens, mulled around outside and inside, waiting for the new and it was rumored very young band members to show up. The Carter family had not yet appeared on the scene, much less Jimmy Rogers. That would be in the next year, and their music would help repair the damage that was about to occur. One can almost characterize the sounds the audience was about to hear as a lost strand in country music that never had a follow-up, the dawn of a style that was stillborn from the very rapaciousness of its only practitioners, a kind of singing, instrumental work and lyrical tradition that no one had ever heard of before, coming from distant and lonely hollows, caves and hills, from Appalachian parts unknown. No one ever learned of just where the foursome came from exactly, When asked by their manager, Gus Ashby, the usually less than talkative Andy Sharpens only motioned toward the east and muttered, "From over yonder, beneath the sad hills by the once fresh waters of the Crystal Lake." "Well, Mr. Ashby, you must understand. I save my voice for the most important things, my music. I hear it so often and absorb the shuffling chords so deep into my bones that I have so little time for anything else." Once he showed the startled man a thick accordion file of songs. It was on a sultry Saturday evening in 1926 that a promotional concert was being given at the local radio station, WKVR, in Covingford, Kentucky. That isn't the real name, you understand. I could tell you, but I don't want you trying to trace this. And simultaneously as a costly experiment on a sister station, WWIZ. The concert, set to last about an hour, had several players and bands lined up. One source claimed that Eck Robertson was supposed to make an appearance that night and play both Apple Blossom and Fort Deer, two recordings that he would never end up releasing. There were a few others whose names do not matter. A new artist, who'd had one small hit, was now introducing his new songs. What that first album was no one knows anymore. There was only one song per side in those days. You should know that rumors followed those songs as well, but no one else, I think, has been able to track them down. A number of people, all amongst its most prominent citizens, mulled around outside and inside, waiting for the new and it was rumored very young band members to show up. The Carter family had not yet appeared on the scene, much less Jimmie Rodgers. That would be in the next year, and their music would help repair the damage that was about to occur. One can almost characterize the sounds the audience was about to hear as a lost strand in country music that never had a follow-up, the dawn of a style that was stillborn from the very rapaciousness of its only practitioners. A kind of singing, instrumental work and lyrical tradition that no one had ever heard of before, coming from distant and lonely hollows, caves, and hills, from Appalachian parts unknown. No one ever learned of just where the foursome came from exactly. When asked by their manager, Gus Ashby, the usually less than talkative Andy Sharpens only motioned toward the east and muttered, "From over yonder, beneath the sad hills by the once fresh waters of the Crystal Lake." Once challenged on why he was so taciturn, he also responded with, "Well, Mr. Ashby, you must understand I save my voice for the most important things, my music. I hear it so often and absorb the shuffling chords so deep into my bones that I have so little time for anything else." Once he showed the startled man a thick accordion file of songs, which subsequently disappeared. What they might have done in the world is best left unanswered. So when finally the family made its way onto the tiny stage, this wasn't the Grand Ole Opry, mind you, there were four of them, the two sisters, Hanny Sharpens and Carmilla Drakens, her husband Donnie, and the aforementioned songwriter Andy. He bade the crowd welcome, pausing a moment as the others, meandering about, joined them. There were perhaps 30 or 40 people there that night. Once again, the town's best citizens and a few prominent farmers. Just a few remembered it well, less could articulate what really took place. Andy began speaking slowly and deliberately, his speech too thick and stretched out for even country folk. "This here ballad is not one of just my own composing, but is one passed down across centuries, through many days and many lives." He strummed on the guitar, began tapping his foot, and as the others, his sisters on fiddle and autoharp, Donnie on dulcimer, he said, "It tells the tale of faithless Annie." Then the music began. The instruments combined in odd ways, producing an eerie if indirectly grating sound that seemed to linger for a few seconds and then fade from the consequences. He strummed on the guitar, began tapping his foot, and as the others, his sisters on fiddle and honor harp, Donnie on dulcimer. So, when finally the family made its way onto the tiny stage, this wasn't the Grand Ole Opry, mind you. There were 4 of them. The 2 sisters, Henny Sharpens and Carmilla Drakens, her husband Donnie, and the aforementioned songwriter Andy. He bade the crowd welcome, pausing a moment as the others meandering about joined them. There were perhaps 30 or 40 people there that night. Once again the town's best citizens, and also a few prominent farmers. Just a few remembered it well. Less could articulate what really took place. Andy began speaking slowly and deliberately, his speech too thick and stretched out for even country folk. This here ballad is not one of just my own composing, but is one passed down across centuries, through many days and many lives. He strummed on the guitar, began tapping his foot, and as the others, his sisters, on fiddle and autoharp, Donnie on dulcimer, got ready, he said, "It tells the tale of faithless Annie." Then the music began. The instruments combined in odd ways, producing an eerie, if indirectly grating sound that seemed to linger for a few seconds and then fade from the consciousness of the listeners. As the tune came into full swing, somber and playful, whimsical and wistful, yet so sad at the same time, the fiddle and autoharp were the most haunting and prominent instruments within the performance. In a moment, Andy began to sing. His voice was described as beautiful but modulated in a way that the witnesses found difficulty in describing, and which barely seemed natural. Faithless Annie, dark-haired Annie, who turned her ears away from the cries of dear sweet Adam, who had no understanding why. Faithless Annie, deceitful Annie, she spoke soft lies. We shall love ever after, dearest one. We shall be together until sunset has come. The song told the story of 2 lovers, Adam and Annie, who had agreed, since their families opposed the match, to meet at the crossroads at midnight and run away. Instead, apparently from her devising, Adam is met and killed by her 4 brothers, who felt only contempt for him. The song implies that it was only a flirtation for her, and once she was satisfied he adored her uncontrollably, she consented to let her family do what they really wanted. A larger story, you might say, is implied, but we learn nothing more in this version. There is an almost predatory vibe hinted at, as if she, along with her family, were some kind of vampire or lamia. In the middle of the song, as Andy switched instruments, there was a fiddle and autoharp duet between brother and sister that went on into an old reel that made the audience's toes begin tapping, almost uncontrollably. As the final lyrics were sung, well, another instrumental duet followed, and here the problems began. First to notice was the owner, Regis Hillman. He apparently didn't care for old-time music and so hadn't been listening. The broadcast seemed to be out of balance, and a strange sound came out of the studio. As he rushed toward it, he saw through the circular window couples dancing uncontrollably and the rising fiddle and autoharp duet growing more intense. People were dancing, some as couples, some alone, each one odd and with an intensity that he found scary. A number of women continued weeping and shaking from learning about Adam's fate and dancing at the same time. The whole scene struck him as a mad puppet show. Andy began singing another verse, possibly the chorus again. Regis wasn't sure, but the dancing had begun intensifying as he did so. The most notable effect was that time had somehow become syrupy, not just slow, but thick and stretched out, as if a 4.5-minute song were now hours. Once again he saw the dancing, a kind of madman's square dance, arranging itself in a ritual form he had never seen before, rhythmic, deliberate, controlled were words he'd later use, but even he found it very difficult describing what happened next. This dance revved up at an even further intensity, the whirling about and daring do getting worse. Gradually, in this new thick molasses of slow time, a slowly growing reverberation took hold. No one who was just observing in the booth guessed what it might mean. This next sound had begun at a low level, but fairly quickly an increasing number of the dancers had to be held up by their partners, who were also struggling in some unseen way. The reverberation became a quiet crackle and was getting louder and much more pronounced as the participants lost control of themselves and continued dancing, shuffling, and engaging in increasingly ritualistic moves. Shortly thereafter, two distinct sounds were noticed, that of bones in feet, hips, and ankles breaking, and the agonizing twisting of muscles, tendons, veins, and cartilage, as the intensity reached insane speeds at their turning, cavorting, and shuffling. The dance went from swift moves with a partner to rhythmic stomping, to wild twisting and whirling across the dance floor, knocking into other people and getting entangled with them, pulling apart and hearing a crack of bone. Good God, I interjected, how could he do it? Had they been hypnotized? Think of an older idea. Ensorcelled is perhaps the better word. And so, unable to stop, the number of injuries began increasing. Limbs were pulled and broken or bent, backs twisted, even hips cracked, as a more than natural energy infused the area. The last thing that happened left even Regis, a very religious man by the way, intensely troubled and broken for years. The last thing that happened left even Regis, a very religious man by the way, intensely troubled and broken for years. You see, and you probably already have guessed this, it was a ritual, but of what kind or purpose, neither I nor anyone else could fathom from reading what information we had at the time. That was, of course, until the second incident. In the middle of the crowd, but spaced between a dozen of the central dancers, who now struggled on, enduring the dance either through fortitude or through some enduing of preternatural energy, there began a sporadic and intense flashing at different points between a number of the dancers. It trembled and creeped into existence among them softly, then with more intensity. Half-seen figures with azure and turquoise eyes, glowing profusely, were now there between them. These figures were just beginning to move within the crowd in suggestive, hideous ways. We just thought they were somehow pushing their way in, wriggling out of the many unseen wombs of hell. He did not have the vocabulary to express it, being stunned and traumatized at the same time. He tried signaling to the booth to stop the transmission. The crew inside seemed just as controlled as the audience, although just standing there going through the motions of their work and keeping the music going out over the airwaves. He ran around and past the performers, nearly skidding at one point, in what would have been a normally impossible move. He was sure Andy had reached out to try and stop him in between notes, which had now slowed down even further. If he had waited a half-second more, he later confessed he was sure Andy would have been able to stop him. Long after, he would repeat a phrase that came to him, a gap in time. The clock was being slowed down just enough, manipulated, perhaps even wrenched sideways, so something could get in. Minds, entities, wraiths, he did not know what they might be, but what he had seen was cold and dark and lost in everlasting decay. Now Regis could have gone for the booth, but instead he went for the master setup that transmitted the signal and powered the broadcast and sound systems. For one moment he looked back across the studio and nearly lost consciousness. At nearly the cost of his life he yanked the switch. The radio station, the speakers in the studio and dance floor, all of it went silent. His quick thinking had saved everyone from an ever-worsening situation, a situation he had unknowingly helped bring about. The horror had barely abated when he turned around, then jumped backwards from a strange static shock that spontaneously built up behind and reached out toward him. Moans and frantic pleas for help filled the studio. Soon all the ambulance and doctors that anyone could spare from wider parts would come. Regis turned and looked at the family, focusing mainly on Andy with a stare that must have conveyed a great deal. "Get out and never come back," he told him in words that would have been daggers to anyone else. Instead, Andy just grinned, tipped the straw hat he wore, and began gathering everything up. He called after Regis. "It couldn't be helped, Mr. Hillman. We didn't expect it to be amplified like that, nor work so well. Our kindred almost came back." In the moment the words didn't quite register in Regis' mind. Instead, the owner went to help, but soon saw too many mangled limbs and too many broken bones sticking out. There was blood everywhere, and he almost slipped more than once, as if some atrocity had been committed. There were more injuries than he could count. Now, in the middle of the dance floor, he froze for a few moments, overwhelmed by what he saw. Whatever the strange figures were, from wherever they had come, he no longer saw any sign of them. Regis finally went to help any way he could, but the injuries were so grievous. A few of them would die, a few more would be cripples, even quadriplegics for life. For a long time after the ambulances and doctors and police had left, he would sit there on the steps leading to the stage, weeping himself. Regis found he could not stop, nor could he cease the trembling that was now everywhere through his body. When he reached out to help someone, an old friend from childhood, he noticed his wife propped up against the stage, all of her limbs in odd positions, her midriff even twisted, her hips dislodged under the flesh, and now uneven. She'd be crippled for the rest of her days. No amount of money or surgeries could fix the damage he saw everywhere. The elusive Andy and the rest of the clan had just been seen going stealthily out of the back, all smiles and walking with light, easy steps. The sound of a motor starting and then a car speeding away preceding the sounds of other approaching emergency vehicles. Only rumors of their having gone to another state ever reached anyone concerned. Eck Robertson had missed the whole ordeal, sitting quietly in the green room, waiting for his call to perform, cleaning his fiddle with intense care when no one came for him. Nothing further was revealed to him as he had been escorted out of the building by the police, paid by Regis, and then taken to his hotel. All of this disaster was not enough for that night, for pleas were coming into the station from around the community. A wide net had been cast which caught many more people. The impact was huge. Regis would now be an outcast in his own community, county, and state for the rest of his days. Worse still, as I said, was the effect it had on those listening outside over the radio transmission. It was a powerful station at the time and reached several communities. Maybe it was just a matter of timing and other factors, or maybe for some, other powers were at play. Something like 500 or 600 people were injured. The strange sound contagion had been uneven in its menace, striking one household or farm at full force, and at another being dispersed or diminished. Frantic calls and messengers who could run came flooding into doctors and local hospitals as well. No one understood how radio, already an experience for so many, could do this. It would remain a mystery those poor people never solved. Some saw it as an act of God, although, let me tell you, it was as far from that as you can get. I almost suspect someone or something had conducted an experiment. It makes me shudder if I let myself suspect for one moment that it was related to other things I've witnessed. What things? I asked, puzzled. Other occasions, other stories, he replied. After a moment he continued. This story was costing him something, I could see already. I did not want to add to his troubles, yet his telling it to me seemed important for him, so I did not interrupt again. The actual radio station and the record company did not last much beyond that night. Regis was charitable to the point of almost exhausting his own funds. The next year he opened a dry goods store and then a magazine stand somewhere in Ohio. The studio, even the building, would remain closed, boarded up and neglected for decades afterwards. Many years later, a flood sweeping through town from the mountains would wipe away many of the buildings in the downtown area. While it still stood, it was derelict. Most avoided it at all cost, repeating strange rumors about what had happened, and the whispering lights that sometimes came back deep in the night. It was through such urban legends that folklorists first recorded the rumors, and I and the others came across it. As for Andy Sharpens and his clan, nothing more was heard for years. until the great-grandson of one of the original investors in that old defunct radio station had gone and claimed some documents from a warehouse where material related to the business was stored, and then uncovered one of the few remaining records. On a sunny day in 1972, there was another instance of that same voice and music heard at a party. What happened then I know much more about. I was there, you see, he then concluded, leaving me wondering now as I write this later at night, what did happen all those years later. I hope, at least I believe I do, that I will soon find out. So now you can see how this single thread was hung there in front of me. I thought I could just manage a little tug and then cut the proffered string loose, but instead the itch returned and I kept on tugging obsessively at it. It reminds me of something my grandmother used to say. It had seemed like such a casual warning. Once a thread on a garment had loosened, if you tugged at it, the thread would eventually unravel no matter how long it took, bit by bit, strand by strand. If you pull a string, you might undo the whole thing, she would say. I am only now just beginning to understand how deep that truth goes. I am delivering these stories one at a time to make it all easier on the palate. As you will learn, that is only a temporary mercy, and the process will be completed sooner or later, since it will be a little here, a little there, a tug here, a tug there, story upon story, until the process is complete. And now for you that single thread has begun to unwind. If you pull a string, didn't I warn you? But you've already begun this journey, haven't you? But don't worry, dear friends. I will be here to guide you along the way. This has been a Story Preeminent Fiction podcast presented by Broken Circle. Pull a String. Created, conducted, and narrated by Stephen L. Dailey. Photographs by Stephanie Dailey. Music courtesy of Scott Buckley. Next episode, A Tale of Two Malls.